No one expected a courtroom to turn into a breaking news battlefield. The room was tense, but controlled the kind of tension that lives under polished wood desks and formal language. Lawyers shuffled papers. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras quietly recorded every word. Then everything changed. The officer stepped closer, his voice sharp, authority heavy in every syllable. Across from him stood a black member of Parliament.com, composed, refusing to step back as she questioned his conduct. The exchange grew louder. The judge called for order, but frustration had already crossed a line. In a moment that stunned everyone watching, the officer's hand came up and the sound echoed across the courtroom as slapped gasps exploded through the gallery. Pens dropped. Someone whispered, "Did that really just happen?" For a split second, time froze and then instinct took over. She didn't hesitate, didn't panic. One motion, one response. The officer hit the floor. Chairs scraped, voices rose. Court security rushed forward. Reporters stood on their feet. Cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of a moment no one could take back. But what shocked the room even more was her reaction afterward. She didn't shout, she didn't celebrate, she stood still, breathing steadily, eyes forward, not like someone who had just been attacked, but like someone who had been preparing for a confrontation long before that day. Within minutes, clips began spreading online. MP attacked in court, officer struck, then knocked down. Millions of views, thousands of opinions. One explosive question spreading across the internet. What really happened in that courtroom? Because this wasn't just a loss of control. This wasn't just a viral moment. It was the breaking point. And what the world didn't know yet was that this confrontation had been building for months. To the millions now, watching the viral clip, she was a headliner. But long before that courtroom moment, she had been something else entirely. Her name carried weight in the communities it rarely made. National news, neighborhoods where promises were broken, voices were ignored, and authority too often went unquestioned. She didn't come from political privilege. She came from a working-class family that understood struggle, where resilience wasn't a slogan, it was survival. Before Parliament, she was an advocate. Before titles, she was an organizer. She built her reputation listening to people who believed no one in power ever would. Families who lost loved ones, workers who faced discrimination, citizens who felt the system spoke about them, but never to them, and she had a pattern. She didn't shout. She didn't chase attention. She asked questions, calm/direct, and impossible to dismiss. That calmness became her strength. While others debated loudly, she documented it. While critics called her difficult, her supporters called her fearless. Every investigation she pushed, every hearing she demanded, pointed at the same thing: accountability for institutions that operated without it. To some, she was a champion. To others, she was a problem. Law enforcement unions criticized her oversight efforts. Political opponents accused her of undermining authority. Commentators labeled her controversial. But the community she represented saw something different. They saw someone who didn't back down when rooms turned cold. Someone who stayed composed when voices rose. Someone who understood that power often relied on intimidation and refused to be intimidated. Inside Parliament, her reputation was clear. She was respectful, prepared, unshakable, and perhaps most important of all, she never reacted emotionally, even when others did. That's why the courtroom footage confused so many people. The woman who stood her ground that day wasn't impulsive. She wasn't aggressive. She was someone who had spent years facing pressure, criticism, and resistance, and learning how to stand firm without losing control. Because for her, this work was never about winning arguments. It was about protecting dignity. And that's what made the moment so explosive, because her presence in that courtroom wasn't routine. She wasn't there to observe. She was there to question, to challenge, to confront something powerful. Something that had already made people uncomfortable long before that officer ever raised his hand. The hearing wasn't routine. For weeks, the courtroom had been preparing for a case that many hoped would stay quiet. Allegations of excessive force, unlawful dissension, and a pattern of complaints that community leaders said had been ignored for years. Residents had come forward with stories that sounded painfully familiar. Stops that escalated without reason. Searches without explanation. Force used where calm might have worked. Individually, each complaint could be dismissed. Together, they painted a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. That's why she was there. Not as a spectator, not as a politician chasing headlines. She was there representing the voices behind the complaints, families who said they had filed reports and never heard back, young people who believed they were being treated like suspects in their own neighborhoods, community groups demanding transparency instead of internal silence. Across the room sat the department's representatives, uniforms pressed, statements prepared, language careful and controlled. Their position was clear. Procedures had been followed, actions were justified, and officers were being unfairly targeted by public pressure and political activism. From the very beginning, the atmosphere carried an edge. Every question she asked was precise. Dates, body camera logs, user force reports, training protocols, and every answer came back guarded. But one officer stood out, the same officer who would later be seen in the viral footage. Throughout the proceedings, his posture told its own story. Arms crossed, jaw tight, responses clipped and defensive. When asked about specific incidents, his tone carried frustration that edged into irritation at one point. He interrupted at another. He challenged the premise of her questions entirely. The judge reminded him to remain professional, but the tension didn't fade. Each exchange between them grew shorter, sharper, more personal. To him, the hearing felt like an accusation to her. His resistance felt like proof of the problem she was there to expose. Around them, the room felt the shift. Reporters leaned in closer. Community observers exchanged uneasy looks. Because what had started as a formal review of policy was slowly turning into something else. A direct confrontation between authority and accountability. And as the questioning continued, the distance between professional disagreement and personal conflict grew thinner. Then the exchange stopped being about procedure, and it became about respect. By the time the questioning reached its final phase, the air inside the courtroom felt heavy. What had begun as formal testimony was no longer moving at a steady pace. Each answer came slower. Each question landed harder. The distance between professionalism and frustration was shrinking with every exchange. She leaned forward, voice calm but firm. "Officer, according to the report, the individual was restrained before force was applied. Can you explain why escalation continued after compliance?" A pause. The officer shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. "As I've already stated," he replied. His tone clipped. The situation was dynamic. Decisions had to be made quickly. She didn't raise her voice. "I understand that. But body camera footage shows no active resistance at that point. So I'll ask again, what justified the additional force?" A murmur moved through the gallery. The officer exhaled sharply. "What justified it?" he said, leaning forward now. "Was my professional judgment. Something that people outside the field don't always understand." The judge glanced up. "Officer, please answer the question directly." But the tension had already shifted. She remained steady. "This hearing isn't questioning your profession," she said. "It's reviewing your actions. There's a difference." His posture stiffened. One hand pressed against the table. "With respect," he shot back. "What's happening here feels less like a review and more like an accusation." Her eyes didn't move. "If the facts feel accusatory," she replied quietly, "that's not because of the questions." A few reporters looked up from their notes. The officer's composure began to crack. His voice grew louder. "You weren't there," he said. "You don't know what officers face in real time. It's easy to sit here and second-guess decisions made in seconds." "And it's easy," she answered, still controlled, "to call it pressure instead of accountability." The judge raised a hand. "Let's keep the tone professional." But neither of them moved back. The room had gone silent now, the kind of silence that comes when everyone senses the conversation is no longer routine. The officer leaned back, shaking his head, a short, dismissive laugh escaping. "This is exactly the problem," he muttered. "People who don't understand the job trying to tell us how to do it." She straightened. "This isn't about telling you how to do your job," she said. "It's about making sure the power that comes with that job isn't used without consequence." For a moment, they just stared at each other. Authority on one side, accountability on the other. The judge spoke again, firmer this time. "Officer, answer the question or we will move on." But the officer didn't look at the judge. His attention stayed locked on her. The frustration in his expression had shifted into something sharper. Personnel. His chair scraped slightly as he stood. Gasps rippled softly through the room. The judge's voice rose. "Officer, sit down." But the distance between them was already closing. And in that charged space between restraint and reaction, the line was crossed. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. The officer stood over her position, breathing hard, the frustration that had been building throughout the hearing now visible in every line of his face. The judge's voice cut through the tension. "Officer, return to your seat immediately." But he didn't step back. She remained where she was, shoulders squared, expression steady, not confrontational, not afraid, just present, just unshaken. "Please return to your seat," the judge repeated, sharper this time. The officer turned toward her instead. "You don't get it," he said, his voice low but charged. "You sit here questioning people like me as if you understand what we deal with." She didn't raise her voice. "This isn't about me," she replied calmly. "It's about your actions." Something in that answer snapped the last thread of restraint. His hand came up fast. The sound cracked through the courtroom. A slap, loud, unmistakable, echoing off wood and marble. For a heartbeat, the entire room froze. A reporter's pen fell to the floor. Someone in the gallery gasped. The judge stood, stunned, and then instinct took over. She didn't hesitate, didn't lash out in anger, didn't panic. Her response was immediate, controlled, the kind of reaction that comes from reflex, not rage. She stepped forward, deflecting his space, her movement precise and defensive. The officer lost his balance, darted. A single motion. He went down hard against the floor. Chairs scraped. Voices exploded. Someone shouted, "Security!" Court officers rushed forward from both sides. The gallery erupted into overlapping noise, shock, confusion, disbelief. But in the middle of the chaos, she didn't move. She didn't advance. She didn't raise her voice. She stepped back, hands visible, breathing steady, her expression composed. Not triumphant, not shaken, just controlled. The officer on the ground looked stunned, more by the sudden reversal than the fall itself. The security moved between them immediately, separating both sides, voices calling for order. The judge's gavel struck repeatedly. Order, order in the court. But order was already gone, because everyone in that room understood what had just happened. Authority had crossed a line, and for the first time, that line had pushed back. Across the gallery, phones were already in hands. Reporters were speaking urgently into recorders. Camera operators, the official court feed. The media pool had never stopped filming. Every second, every angle, every sound. Within minutes, clips would be uploaded, shared, replayed, debated. Because the confrontation itself was shocking. But what happened next would make it impossible to contain. The courtroom chaos was only the beginning, because the cameras had captured everything. It took less than an hour for the first clip to appear online. A shaky 30-second segment. The slap. The response. The officer hitting the floor. The stunned silence that followed. By the time the court session officially adjourned, the video was already spreading faster than any statement could contain. At first it moved through local reporters and legal commentators. Then it hit social media, and everything changed. Within hours, the footage was everywhere. Different angles, slow-motion edits, frame-by-frame breakdowns, headlines written in real time as millions of people watched the same shocking moment unfold on their screens. His courtroom clash began trending. Then hashtag stand your ground. Then hashtag power and accountability. The reactions came fast, and they didn't agree. For some viewers, the video confirmed their worst fears about unchecked authority. They pointed to the moment the officer stepped forward, the escalation, the strike itself. This is exactly why oversight matters. Power crossed a line and got exposed. But others focused on her response. Debates erupted in comment sections, talk shows, and live streams. Should a public official use physical force? Was it self-defense or retaliation? Legal analysts weighed in. Former officers gave interviews. Civil rights advocates organized online forums. Police organizations released carefully worded statements calling for full context. The clip crossed borders by nightfall. International outlets picked it up. Morning news shows replayed the footage. Panel discussions argued over tone, timing, and responsibility. And through it all, one thing drove the story forward. Everyone felt like they were watching history unfold in real time, because this wasn't just a courtroom dispute anymore. It had become a national conversation, then a cultural flashpoint, then something even bigger. A public test of where people stood when authority and accountability collided on camera. Meanwhile, the full video, the entire exchange leading up to the moment, hadn't been released yet, which meant speculation filled the gaps. Edited clips shaped opinions. Partial narratives hardened into certainty. And the pressure began to build on the department, on the court, on the government, on everyone connected to what had happened in that room. By the end of the day, one question dominated every headline: who would be held responsible? Because public opinion was already forming, and if officials didn't act quickly, the narrative would be decided without them. Then the authorities made a decision that shocked everyone. By the next morning, the official response came. The police department announced an internal investigation. At first glance, the statement sounded balanced, neutral language, promises of a thorough review, and assurances that all parties involved would be examined. But one line stood out. It confirmed that the Member of Parliament's use of physical force was also under evaluation. Within minutes, the wording sparked outrage. Community leaders questioned why the response seemed to focus on her reaction rather than the officer's initial strike. Advocacy groups accused the department of attempting to shift blame. Commentators began asking a familiar question: was the system protecting itself? The pressure intensified when an anonymous source leaked that early internal discussions had raised the possibility of misconduct charges against the MP. The backlash was immediate. Legal experts pointed out the obvious. The viral clip showed a direct physical strike from the officer first. Civil rights attorneys argued that her response met the legal standard for public opinion, already divided, began shifting sharply. Then the witnesses spoke. Several people present in the courtroom gave recorded statements describing the officer's behavior before the incident. His tone, his refusal to sit down, the moment he stepped forward despite the judge's order. A court reporter confirmed the escalation. A security officer described the officer's posture as aggressive. In behind the scenes, investigators reviewed the official court recording, not the edited clips circulating online, but the uninterrupted footage from multiple angles. What they saw complicated the early narrative, frame by frame. The sequence became clear. The verbal tension. The judge's repeated instructions, the officer standing, the advance, the strike, and then the immediate defensive response. Meanwhile, the department faced a growing public relations crisis. Each attempt to emphasize both sides was met with criticism that the response felt like institutional reflex, caution toward accountability, urgency toward damage control. Even within law enforcement circles, quiet divisions began to surface. Some officials defended the officer, citing stress and pressure. Others acknowledged privately that the situation on camera was difficult to justify. As more details emerged, the tone of coverage began to shift. What started as a viral confrontation was becoming something else, a test of whether the investigation would follow the evidence or protect a badge. Then came the turning point. The court announced that the complete unedited footage every minute leading up to the incident would be released publicly. And when the full video came out, the story changed overnight. The moment the full footage went public, the tide began to turn. Across the city, communities who had long felt silenced finally found a voice, amplified by her courage. Local leaders spoke out, calling her response measured, principled, and a powerful example of standing firm against abusive authority. Civil rights groups released statements praising her composure and condemning the officer's initial aggression. Legal experts broke down the sequence publicly, explaining that every action she took was instinctive self-defense, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Online, hashtags evolved from shock to support. Hashtag justice for her, hashtag power held accountable, hashtag courage in action. Each post, retweet, and share carried a message. This was not just a courtroom incident. This was a statement. Television panels replayed the footage, analyzing her calm demeanor and measured response. Her restraint became the narrative's heart. Analysts noted that, unlike sensationalized headlines, she never sought vengeance. Her actions reflected dignity, discipline, and decades of principled advocacy. Community organizations organized rallies, crowds chanted her name outside government buildings. The MP had always been known for connecting with people, listening to their struggles, and standing up for the marginalized. Now, in real time, her reputation spread beyond political circles into homes and neighborhoods across the nation. Meanwhile, within the department, accountability began to take tangible form. The officer was officially suspended pending further review. Internal discussions turned cautious, knowing that public scrutiny now demanded transparency. The investigation, once framed to question her, was now squarely on the officer's conduct. Her colleagues in Parliament expressed solidarity. Emails, calls, and statements poured in. Her courage became a rallying point for anyone who had faced institutional resistance or discrimination. Citizens and politicians alike were reminded that principle, when exercised fearlessly, could shift power dynamics in real time. Public perception was no longer divided by speculation. The narrative had crystallized. She had acted in self-defense with restraint and integrity. The momentum of justice was building, and it seemed unstoppable. Yet for all the public praise and surging support, her reaction to the ordeal remained measured, almost unexpected. She did not use this moment for personal gain, for dramatics, or for political leverage. Instead, her response was something far more powerful. And it would leave everyone watching stunned when the cameras finally caught her on the steps of the courthouse. The world waited for fury. The reporters leaned in, pens poised, microphones angled. Headlines expected outrage, speeches dripping with revenge. But what came instead was quiet, measured, unshakable. She spoke with a calm authority that had defined her career. Today, she said, we saw what happens when power forgets accountability. But this isn't about anger. It's about ensuring respect, safety, and fairness for every citizen, every officer, and every community member. Her words rippled through newsrooms and social media alike. Analysts paused, commentators nodded. Even critics found themselves reconsidering the narrative. She wasn't seeking vengeance. She wasn't attacking an individual. She was addressing the system. She called for immediate de-escalation training across departments, stressing that authority must be tempered with responsibility. She advocated for reforms that would prevent incidents like this from ever happening again, framing the conversation around respect, professionalism, and human dignity. Leadership, she said, is not proving you are stronger. Leadership is holding yourself accountable and making sure those around you uphold the same standards. That is the measure of true power. Her voice remained steady, yet every word carried weight. Each phrase reframed the viral moment from a confrontation into a lesson, from outrage into inspiration, from spectacle into policy. People across the nation were inspired not by a fight won, but by a restraint exercised, by courage tempered with principle, by a reminder that strength is not measured in retaliation, but in moral clarity. Civil rights organizations echoed her message, sharing statements and resources. Community leaders cited her as a model for responding to provocation with dignity. Every replay of the courtroom clip now carried new meaning. Not just shock, but a call for systemic change. And as the world absorbed her message, one truth became clear. The impact of that single moment, captured on camera, had evolved beyond anger, beyond controversy, and into something far more enduring. The outcome would send a message far beyond that courtroom in the weeks that followed. The courtroom incident became more than a headline. It became a turning point. Policy discussions were launched at the national level. Training programs were reviewed. Guidelines on the use of force were scrutinized like never before. Lawmakers debated reforms that had lingered on the sidelines for years. The conversation had shifted from isolated misconduct to systemic accountability. Across the country, communities reflected on what they had witnessed. Citizens, especially those long marginalized, saw in her actions a symbol of courage under pressure. Shared the footage not to relive the confrontation, but to remind themselves that standing firm against abuse of power was possible and necessary. A moment of calm, precise action became a rallying point. It showed that authority could be challenged without surrendering dignity. It demonstrated that strength was measured not in retaliation, but in restraint and principle. Leaders from various sectors cited her example in speeches, articles, and social media posts. Schools, activist organizations, and civic groups used the incident as a case study in accountability, ethics, and leadership. The viral video became more than a spectacle. It became a lesson. Every replay reminded viewers that power must answer to accountability, that courage matters, even in the face of intimidation, that one moment, one decision, one refusal to be powerless could shift the conversation for millions. For her, the impact was not about recognition, it was about change, about the communities she represented, about the system she had long sought to improve. Every message of support, every policy review, every public debate reinforced the truth she had embodied. Action under pressure can spark progress far greater than any speech, because sometimes history doesn't change with a speech. It changes the moment someone refuses to be powerless.